All right, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Ellen Huckabee from Alabama, and thank y'all for attending this monthly webinar, the All Bugs Good and Bad webinar. This month, our presenter is Dr. Derek Mathias. He is an assistant professor at the Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory in Vero Beach, Florida, in the Department of Entomology and Nematology at the University of Florida. His research focuses on the transmission cycles of malaria, parasites, and arboviruses, particularly how associated factors influence transmission dynamics. So Dr. Mathias, thank you so much for agreeing to be our presenter today, and we look forward to learning a lot.
And I'm sharing those results now for our panelists, and for Derek, if you just want to check those out, I'm sharing the results of that first poll.
Okay. So I just go ahead and take over now?
Yep, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, how's that?
Yep, looks good.
All right, Ellen, thank you so much for that introduction. And as Ellen said, my name is Derek Mathias, and the webinar title today is Mosquito-Borne Diseases in the United States. And what I thought I would do, this is just a brief outline of the webinar. I thought I would just introduce you first to arboviruses in general, and then go through some basic concepts I think are important for understanding the risk of mosquito-borne transmission of arboviruses. And then I'll talk about those that are endemic or that naturally occur in the United States, and go through signs and symptoms of arboviral illnesses. And then I'll finish by going through ones that I think have the most potential for introduction. And then there's some good lessons from the past. West Nile virus in particular, I think is a good case study. It sort of was the perfect storm for the introduction of an arbovirus. And then we have dengue virus is one that's has kind of come and gone throughout the history of our country, and it's consistently knocking at our doorstep. Chikungunya followed a similar path to Zika virus and popped up in our hemisphere in 2013. And then I'll wrap up with predictions about what I foresee could happen with Zika virus and both dengue and chikungunya. I think those are the ones that are we're at greatest risk of at least in certain parts of the country where transmission could occur. And then the final few slides will be what people can do to protect themselves from mosquito-borne illnesses. All right, so there are more than 500 arboviruses are known, and arbo just means arthropod-borne. There are more than 100 or so that infect humans, but only there's only a small percentage that are very common and that we're concerned about. About 40 or so infect livestock, but then some are capable of infecting both humans and animals, and we call these zoonotic diseases. And I'll talk a little bit more about that more later on in the webinar. These, particularly the viruses that we have circulating that are naturally occurring in the United States, are the greatest cause of viral-associated encephalitis or inflammation of the brain. So when we go through some of these, I'll talk about neuroinvasive disease, and that's what I'm talking about, ones that cause encephalitis. And some of these cases tend to be rare, but the cases are extremely serious. So even for rare arboviruses, it's good to be aware that they're out there. And then mosquitoes are by far the most important vectors of arboviruses, but some are transmitted by ticks and biting midges and sandflies. But I'm just going to focus on the arboviruses today. Now, Mark, if you want to go ahead and cue that first poll question, I just kind of want to get an idea of what they may think is the most important arbovirus disease worldwide. And the ones I have listed here aren't in any particular order, but there's just a few things I want to point out. So in this one, I have on the first column, we have the disease, and then we have the important vectors, or the mosquitoes that transmit those, in the middle column, and then their distribution in the far right column. And you'll notice in the first few that I list, a lot of them are tropical, and you'll see that in that second column, Aedes aegypti is the mosquito that's implicated for a lot of these diseases. And this is a mosquito that had its origin in the tropics in Africa, but it has spread throughout trade, so now it's present pretty much anywhere in the tropics throughout the world, and we'll get into the subtropics and the temperate zone in some places. And this one is highly adapted to to living with humans, and it really takes advantage of things that we do for its ecology. And so this is probably the most important mosquito worldwide in terms of arboviruses. Now, there are some others that you're probably familiar with. The Zika virus got a lot of press the last few years, but 20 years ago, people like me had never even considered it to be an important virus. Similar thing with West Nile virus. Prior to its introduction in the United States, it was considered a pretty benign virus. So some of these things can pop up seemingly out of nowhere, but while others, we have a long history, like yellow fever, we've known about for centuries. So the landscape is forever changing. But so what we think is most important now might not be, in 20 years or 50 years from now. So this is sort of, Mark, I can't see the answer to the poll.
Okay, well, I was sort of waiting. So I'm going to go ahead and end that now, and I'll share the results. Okay. Let me know if you can see. Can you see those?
I don't see them on my screen.
Okay, so West Nile was sort of close. West Nile got 41%, and then second was the Benji.
All right,
I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but
it's fine. Yeah, it's pronounced many different ways by different people. But dengue is definitely the most important. West Nile is a good guess because West Nile is cosmopolitan, so it does have a wider distribution. But if you just look at the number of cases and then the mortality, dengue can cause, in its severest form, it can cause dengue shock syndrome, which is sort of like a hemorrhagic disease. But instead of internal bleeding, you can have plasma leakage. But it can cause shock, and roughly about 20 to 25,000 people die of the disease each year. That's predominantly in Southeast Asia and parts of the Caribbean and Latin America. For a lot of viral diseases, there's no treatment, so you're treating the symptoms. So for places where you have good hospital care and people can get good supportive care, they pull through. But it's certain places where care just isn't as good. And so in the United States, we tend to have very few cases, and I'll go through this later on. Most of our cases are travel related, but we do have some, from time to time, we do have cases of local transmission. Now let's switch gears and talk a little bit about the mosquitoes themselves. So mosquitoes are quite a diverse species, or quite a diverse group of species. They all belong to a single family, but you can see here there are over 3,500 species are recognized. And we split those into two subfamilies. And I just bring this up because this grouping is important for disease purposes. The anophelines are the malaria transmitters. So the mosquito in the upper left corner, this is the most important vector of a parasitic disease, so not a virus. And this one is actually probably about 20 times the cause of, or the number of deaths each year, 20 times that of dengue. So malaria is by far the most important disease transmitted by mosquitoes from a mortality perspective, but we have that under control. And so in the United States, we haven't had malaria since the 1950s, at least consistently. We might have travel-related cases from time to time, but this is not one that we're concerned about. Now the culicines, the bottom two mosquitoes below, the Aedes aegypti mosquito and the southern house mosquito here, now these are two of the most important mosquitoes worldwide. The southern house mosquito is found not just in the United States, it's found throughout the tropic and temperate zone, particularly in the southern hemisphere, and it has a close relative in the northern hemisphere, the northern house mosquito, that's morphologically identical. You can't really tell those apart. And so these are two that are the two bottom ones will be featured prominently throughout this webinar. Now there's a couple within the United States, we have an estimated 176 species that are recognized. I think that includes some that are in Canada as well. And only a handful of these are important for vectoring arboviruses. Now down here in the bottom left, I'm pointing out the Asian tiger mosquito. And this one, if you live in the Southeast, you're probably intimately familiar with this one. It's pretty distinctive with its white stripe on its scutum there, or its back. And it has these sort of striped legs. And this one is very common. It's not the best vector for certain arboviruses, but just because of its sheer commonality and its numbers in suburban areas and people's backyards, this is one that we're concerned about. And then of course the southern house mosquito is pretty ubiquitous as well, and this one, it's been involved in West Nile transmission. Now I have a few others up here in the upper left that typically are just pest mosquitoes, but some of these do take part in transmission. The Ochlorotatus triceriatus is the eastern treehole mosquito, and I'll talk a little bit about La Crosse encephalitis virus, and it's a vector for that one. the take-home point here is that we have lots of mosquitoes. A lot of them you'll never come in contact with. They with their what I have in here in bold about the variation in their biology and behavior is very important, because not all of them are going to feed on people. So not all of them are important from a disease perspective. So it's just a handful that we're really concerned about. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Aedes aegypti and albopictus. These two have very similar types of biology. They're both adapted to live with humans. They are container breeders, and they lay their eggs in anything small that'll hold water. They need very little water to complete their life cycle, and they're very aggressive biters during daylight hours. So we call them diurnal mosquitoes. And this is really important for, if you're wanting to prevent disease transmission, there's certain things that you have to think about with what's in your arsenal. For example, bed nets are very effective against malaria transmitting mosquitoes because they tend to bite at night. They're nocturnal and go after you while you're sleeping. But these mosquitoes, bed nets don't work against them because they're active during the daytime. So understanding just basic things like that about their behavior is important in trying to figure out strategies to combat mosquitoes. Now, Aedes aegypti feeds almost exclusively on humans, so it's pretty efficient at transmitting viruses, while the tiger mosquito in the bottom left is more opportunistic, and it tends to feed on a wider range of mammals. Now, there is variation from one population to the next, so this isn't a hard and fast rule, because we have seen cases, particularly, there's a good example with chikungunya in the Indian Ocean region, where it was a predominant vector in a huge epidemic of chikungunya virus several years ago. So we know this one can be an efficient vector from time to time. So next are the northern and southern house mosquito, these Culex mosquitoes. Both of these are also adapted to live with humans. They lay eggs in a wider range of habitats than the previous two that I showed you, but they tend to prefer stagnant water. Their larvae can survive in very highly polluted water. Sewers, unsealed septic tanks, for example, can be important point sources for these mosquitoes. They're aggressive biters during dusk and early evening, so instead of biting you in the daytime, they're going to come after you. They're probably the ones that are feeding on you at night if you're sitting out on your patio. But these do feed on birds in addition to humans, and this is an important characteristic and why they're good vectors for West Nile, which tends to circulate among birds. Now, all mosquitoes have the same basic life cycle. There are 4 life stages: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And the eggs in the juvenile stages, larvae and pupae, they're aquatic, so they need water for them to survive. Now, the development from the egg to adult takes about a week to 10 days during the summer months. Right now in the spring, when the mosquitoes are starting to come out, this process takes a little bit longer, so it's temperature dependent. And adult females use the blood to produce eggs, and they feed about every 3 to 4 days during the height of the summer. And virus is acquired during blood feeding and then transmitted to new hosts in subsequent feeding events. But note that it takes there's an incubation period that's required before a mosquito become infectious. So I think a lot of people have this misconception that mosquitoes just sort of move viruses around like a dirty needle, but the virus actually has to infect the lining of the mosquito's stomach, what we call the midgut, and it has to replicate. So viruses can't survive on their own. They have to get inside cells and use the host cell machinery to replicate themselves. So they have to replicate within the midgut, escape into the circulatory system of the mosquito, and then get into the salivary glands before they can then transmit to a new host. And that takes a little bit of time. So another way we can group mosquitoes is based on their oviposition or their larval habitat. And four groups are generally recognized. I've already talked a little bit about groups 2 and 4. So group 2 is a transient water group that includes the house mosquitoes. And these are temporary pools, ditches, storm sewers, and things like that, stagnant water. And I've also talked about the number 4, the artificial container group. One is group 1, the permanent pool group. These tend to be more rural type mosquitoes, and these live in permanent sunlit pools and ponds with vegetation. And these can generate large quantities of what would generally be called pest mosquitoes, but they can cause disease or transmit disease in certain circumstances. And then the floodwater group, now these, in this middle picture here, there's a flooded habitat. It shows a pasture with standing water. And these are interesting because the females can lay resting eggs on mud or damp soil, and the eggs are just kind of hanging out there until there's a flood event. And then once the area floods, the eggs hatch, and you have mosquitoes in a week or so. And so um, this can become important for certain rural diseases, and I'll talk about a little bit about Eastern equine encephalitis, because there's a handful of mosquitoes that can transmit that, and that tends to happen where you have swampy, marshy areas. All right, so to understand transmission, I think it's important that this is sort of, you may think I'm pointing out the obvious, but there are three components of a transmission cycle that must all co-occur before transmission can take place. That's that you need a pathogen, a vector, and a host, and they must come together in space and time. And so the pathogen, it has to be able to infect cells and replicate within both the host, which tends to be warm-blooded, not always, but generally it's a bird or a mammal, so it's a warm-blooded host, and then also in the vector, which is ectothermic. And these organisms have very different immune systems, but yes, mosquitoes do have immune systems. They're not quite as complex as our immune system or a bird's immune system, but the virus has to be able to get through both types of organisms. And then the vector must be susceptible to the pathogen, but then also capable of transmission to a new host. This is what we call competent. And not all mosquitoes are competent for a virus. So we do see lots of variation. You'll see some mosquitoes will take a blood meal. The virus never gets into the midgut cells, and it just digests the blood, and the virus just passes right on through and just never infects the mosquito. So not all mosquitoes are capable of transmitting things. And then the host must develop a level of infection in the blood that is also infectious to the vector. Oh, Mark, can you go ahead and cue that second poll question?
Yep.
This is something just to reinforce something that I just said. All right, and so I have a note here that some hosts can become ill while playing no role in transmission, and humans and West Nile virus is a good example of this. So we can get sick, but we don't take part in the transmission cycle. We don't amplify the host or the virus. Now, one more note I should point out is that even if you have these three things coming together and you do have transmission, the efficiency can vary dramatically depending on different things like the climate and the characteristics of the vector. You'll notice in that first table I showed, a lot of these diseases are tropical, and that's because the ecological conditions just aren't good enough in certain parts of the world where it's not warm enough for transmission to be sustained. And that's one reason why that most of the mosquito-borne diseases in the United States tend to follow a very similar pattern where you get the epidemic curve since appears in midsummer and then peaks in late summer, and then it tends to go away in the wintertime. And so a lot of that is climatically driven. Now there's also characteristics of the vector, such as variation in competence and feeding behavior that drive these things as well. So one of the things that it's really easy to understand is how feeding behavior within mosquitoes varies. So when it comes to host preferences, mosquitoes range from broad generalists to narrow specialists. And to find hosts, mosquitoes rely on several cues. Odorants and carbon dioxide are the two biggest ones. Carbon dioxide, the air that we expel when we breathe, is a very reliable cue for them to find us. And then when they get in close proximity, body heat's another one that they cue in on. And we do know that these cues tend to work in combination to enhance one another. So, for example, if you carbon dioxide in combination with certain odorants like lactic acid, which is a component of human sweat, that does enhance mosquito attraction more than either one of them does alone. And then reception of carbon dioxide appears to induce attraction to body heat. So, mosquitoes are pretty complex in their host-seeking capability. Now, a few take-home points about transmission before we move forward into specific examples. First is that all mosquitoes aren't equal in their ability to transmit viruses. So I've already pointed this out, but just sort of reiterating this, that some mosquitoes can transmit a virus, some can't. So the ones listed down here below, the two Aedes mosquitoes can both transmit Zika virus, for example, but the one on the right cannot, and vice versa for West Nile. The Culex mosquitoes are very good at transmitting, while these other two are not. All right, secondly, to cause disease, a mosquito must bite twice, once to get the pathogen, in this case a virus, and then a second time to pass it on, but only after an incubation period. And this tends to take about 7 to 14 days, and it's going to be temperature dependent also. And because of this incubation period, it's the older mosquitoes that are responsible for spreading virus. So that means that, you know, just a small fraction of the total mosquito population are really important for transmission at any given point in time. So let's show some examples of transmission cycles. Sort of the simplest ones just involve mosquitoes and humans. This cartoon in the upper left just shows an urban epidemic cycle. And this is where a mosquito picks up an infection from an infected human host. After the incubation period, then it will feed again on a human host and perpetuate the transmission cycle. So it's very straightforward, very simpler to control in many cases, but it's also, you know, depending on the vector, it can also be a challenge. You know, we see that with urban dengue, where you have population density is high, it can be hard to control these. We saw that last year in Miami with Zika virus. It was, once they got in there, it was a little bit hard to get rid of. Now, secondly, or another way is or what's more common would be zoonotic arboviruses that cycle between mosquitoes and other animals, and then only on occasion do they infect people. So in this case, we would have a mosquito getting an infection from an infected animal, and then after the incubation period, it will then bite humans, and this would be what we call a bridge vector that's connecting humans to the regular transmission cycle. And West Nile virus is a great example of this one. It typically circulates among birds and mosquitoes, and then will occasionally infect people. All right, so these are arboviral illnesses that are endemic to the eastern United States, and I apologize for people who are logging in from the west. Some of these, you do have a Western equine encephalitis. It's very similar and follows similar transmission dynamics, and of course you have West Nile. So these slides do apply to you as well. West Nile is definitely the most common among all of these. And I should point out the different columns here. I do have the illness on the left, the principal vectors, the primary host, and then some important facts. And I don't have time to go through all of the symptoms, but most of them start off the same way: flu-like symptoms, aches, pains, fever, body aches, and then a small percentage of symptomatic cases will become neuroinvasive. So with 1% of those will lead to basically it's encephalitis, and that's where you get the severe form of these illnesses. Now, Eastern equine, about 5% become neuroinvasive. St. Louis, it's even less than that. And then lacrosse, I think it's about, it's similar. I think it's in the single digits. I don't have that listed here. But a key difference with lacrosse is that tends to infect children. So this is the leading cause of encephalitis among children under 16. But the good news for that one is that the case fatality rate is very low, and that most children do recover from the encephalitis and there are no long-term effects. The most severe of these is Eastern equine encephalitis. You see here the case fatality rate is 33%. So 1 out of 3 people who get the severe form of this disease succumb to the illness, and most have long-term effects. So this one is probably among the rarest in the United States, but it's also among the most severe. And there is a Western version, although Western equine encephalitis has even become more rare than Eastern equine. A lot of that has to do with control efforts in California. California does a great job of mosquito control. Now, one thing I want to point out is that all of these, the primary host is an animal. So that's one reason why we're still stuck with these viruses, is that they're circulating in wild animals, and therefore it's really hard to get rid of them. Here's some case data, and this is just showing, this is data I acquired from the CDC website. And you can actually go to this website and you can do a search, for any of these diseases, and you can find lots of good data on there. And these are maps from 2004 to 2013. In the upper left, going counterclockwise, we have lacrosse virus, the number of cases in the United States. Bottom left, we have Eastern equine encephalitis. And the bottom right, St. Louis encephalitis. Now, these are from 2004 to 2013, so this is roughly a 10-year period. So you don't have the most recent years, but the data are kind of similar. And you can see over that range, for most states, it's less than 1 case per year for most of these. Now, you do see differences for lacrosse. I know some people from Tennessee, and I grew up in Western Tennessee, but in Eastern Tennessee, and I'm going to show some county level data here in a second, we do see lots of cases. Now, this is due to the mosquito ecology. Now, lacrosse, this is transmitted by the Eastern treehole mosquito. So you have, in some old hardwood forest, you have a lot more larval habitats. So these trees that have rot holes in them that hold water. And that's where you see a lot of the lacrosse cases. West Virginia is sort of not on the map, but you can see 145. So it sort of makes a swath through this part of the country. You do have quite a bit also up around some of the Great Lakes states as well. And this is county level, and so this is showing incidence instead of case number. And so you can see in some of those cases where a whole state was colored in, it's just a handful of counties in some cases where the cases are occurring. Same thing for Eastern equine encephalitis. This is a very rural disease, so you know, the ecology of the mosquitoes are more in marshy and swampy areas, which is why you just see pockets of Eastern equine encephalitis. And in St. Louis encephalitis is a bit of a mystery because you know, most of the cases now tend to be in Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana and parts of Texas, but has a very similar life cycle or transmission cycle to West Nile virus. The same mosquitoes. It's also bird-borne, a wide variety of birds, but we haven't had any large outbreaks since the 1970s. So this one looks like it might be, you know, some things going on in nature that we're not quite sure, but it's just not as common as it used to be, which is good news for us. Now, I thought I'd spend a little time on West Nile because there's a lot of things we can learn from this one. And so this is a cartoon of the transmission cycle, and this just shows, you know, typically it's transmitted between birds and mosquitoes. And humans and horses are both dead-end hosts, meaning we're not amplifying hosts. So if we get infected, we get sick, but we don't necessarily contribute to the transmission cycle. Now, West Nile was introduced in the United States in 1999. And so I'm going to show a series of range maps here. If you look at the key on the left, the green indicates any West Nile virus activity. So a lot of the green, when those counties are shaded in, it means that there were bird die-offs and they were able to detect West Nile virus in birds. So sort of the surveillance activity. Now, the number of cases, this is incidence per million. So these are a number of new cases. And this is what you can standardize when you're comparing, you know, different locations. So if you look at the number of cases per million, the red dots that'll pop up here in a minute, those are ones where you have greater than or equal to 100 cases per billion, which would be greater than or equal to 1 per 10,000 if you do the math. So if you look here in 1999, we had only 62 total cases following the first introduction. It stayed localized around New York and New Jersey. The following year in 2000, the total number of cases went down, but you can see it's starting to spread a little bit. So you have cases or activity at least in New York and parts of New England. In 2001, it's headed south, so we're seeing most of the cases down in Florida, handful of cases still up in the original area. And you'll notice here it started to take off. So in 2002, you know, we have a dramatic increase in the number of cases. And then when people went back retrospectively, we found, I'm showing up here in the upper left, that a virus mutation occurred in 2001 that enhanced transmissibility by the local mosquitoes. So these viruses can mutate and they can change. And this basically increased vector competence and made it more efficiently transmitted by the mosquito. 2003 was the peak of the epidemic. And you can see in the Midwest, we had just a large increase in the number of cases, and the total was around 10,000. And of those, we had about 2,800 neuroinvasive cases. And the case fatality rate was hovering around just shy of 10%. By 2004, it had reached the Pacific Ocean. And since then, we've had cases off and on every year. 2012 was our last really bad year. But there's some lessons from this. The reason why I'm telling you about this is that West Nile illustrates the importance of an animal reservoir and then also competent mosquitoes for the establishment of new hosts. So we know that a wide range of birds can get West Nile virus, but crows and jays were really efficient, and both of those types of birds are pretty widespread. There are a number of vectors. I'm showing here the southern house mosquito on the left, and then out west, Culex tarsalis is a very important vector. And it tends to have a little bit broader home range than most of the house mosquitoes. So the movement of this mosquito is thought to have contributed to that. Although we're only talking, you know, a few kilometers, maybe 10 kilometers at most. So it's not going far, but it might be far enough to where it's infecting new birds and new hosts. And so its behavior thought to have contributed to that. Now, West Nile is still quite an issue, and you might be surprised, but this is data from 1999 to 2015 from the CDC website, and you can see that incidence per thousand, the darker the color, the shade, the more intense transmission is. And so the Great Plains states seem to be the hotbed, and in the southeast you got Louisiana and Mississippi. And this seems to be the places where the West Nile activity is most intense. And And so the Southeast you might predict, but it's interesting that the data kind of shake out this way. So West Nile is not getting the press that Zika might be, but it's still something that each year we need to pay attention to, and we're still having cases of the neuroinvasive type every year in pretty much every state. All right, so let's switch and talk about ones that I think are threats. And so in this table, in the first column, I've got the illness listed, followed by the vectors, the primary host, and then some important facts. And I'm gonna spend some time talking about Zika, chikungunya, and dengue here in a minute. So let's go down to the bottom here and talk about these other two first. Both of these are sort of regional in where they're located. So Rift Valley fever is only in Eastern and Southern Africa, but it's very severe. So the illness, about 10% of the clinical cases get encephalitis or hemorrhagic fever. So it kind of causes a couple of different things here. High case fatality rate, high mortality in livestock, and it does have a wild animal host, and it can be transmitted by multiple mosquito species. So this one seems to be, it has all the hallmarks of things you don't want to be introduced into your country. So this is being watched pretty intently, and there are lots of restrictions on even doing research on this virus in our country. And then another one is Venezuelan equine encephalitis. This one we have in South America. We actually have had cases in Texas, but not since the 1970s. And this one is closely related to both Eastern and Western equine encephalitis. It's got a small mammal reservoir. So this is another one that we don't want to get in our country, because if it gets into a wild animal population, it's going to be hard to remove. So these two are sort of on the watch list. They're kind of knocking at the door, but we haven't seen any cases of rift in the United States. And Venezuelan equine we haven't seen any in a long time. So, but these are definitely ones to keep in mind in the future. Now, these other three, Zika virus, of course, everyone's probably heard of because of the recent activity. Now, let me go ahead and jump ahead to the next slide. And I'm going to talk about the signs and symptoms of these. This, if you look on the right, this diagram, this is actually from the CDC website about Zika virus, but all of these symptoms, with the exception of the red eyes, are easy to confuse with dengue and chikungunya. So we have three of these co-occurring, which you tend to do down in certain, like in Central and South America and the Caribbean. It's hard to tell what disease you're dealing with unless you get a definitive blood test. So symptoms tend to begin a few days up to a week after a mosquito bite and last 3 to 10 days. Most of the cases, most of the infections are asymptomatic, except for chikungunya, where the opposite is true. Most people who get that do show symptoms. Now, there's no specific treatment, so the CDC recommends treating the symptoms, rest, fluids, fever, and a fever reducer, for example. Zika virus is a little bit different because it is found in a broader range of body fluids, and this is why it can be transmitted sexually. And so there are recommendations on the CDC website about how to handle decisions about planning a family and that sort of thing after you've had a Zika infection. That's a question that I've gotten quite frequently. People want to know, like, what's the risk once you do have an infection? Like, how long is that virus going to stay in your body? And for men, it looks like it's about 90 days to 6 months before it's completely cleared. And I think in women, I think it's 90 days. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the illnesses for Zika and chikungunya rarely require hospitalization. Of course, Zika, the complications with newborn babies that get the virus from the parent is a different story. But in adults, Zika and chikungunya rarely require hospitalization. Dengue can progress to severe illness. So this one can be quite a lot more intense, I guess I should say. Now, with the complications on Zika that I just referred to, it does cause microcephaly, but also other birth defects and fetal brain development, as well as eye defects, hearing loss, and impaired growth. Now, the risk of fetal infection is possible in all the trimesters, but most of the data are pointing to the greatest risk during the first trimester. And then it's important to note that Zika infections in women who are not pregnant do not pose risk for birth defects in future pregnancies. So that's another question that I've gotten quite frequently, particularly when I'm working with university students. That's something they want to know. And it's the virus has to be in the mother's system at the same time while she's pregnant with her baby. So this is one of those things where you can find a lot more information about that at this website here for the or you can just Google CDC, Zika, and pregnancy, and there's a treasure trove of information there on their website. Now, a couple last things I want to point out. One is that the primary hosts for all three of these are humans and monkeys. And fortunately for us, we don't have monkeys in our forest. So, what this would be called the sylvatic part of the transmission cycle, this only occurs in Africa. So in our part of the world, it's just a human mosquito transmission cycle. So that's good for us. We don't have the same threat of spreading like we do, like we did for West Nile virus. And then I should highlight Aedes aegypti is the major vector for these, although Aedes albopictus, we know from laboratory studies, can transmit this. And it's also, there have been some cases of chikungunya and dengue where Aedes albopictus, or the Asian tiger mosquito, has been the main vector, but we haven't seen that so far for Zika. So Mark, you want to go ahead and cue that next question?
Righty. Now this is which arborist does not rely on humans?
Yes.
Okay. Launching now.
All right, and so this is the distribution of the vectors of dengue virus, chikungunya, and Zika. So these two that I was just mentioning, Aedes aegypti, or the yellow fever mosquito, and Aedes the Asian tiger mosquito. This is data from the CDC website, and you'll see the shaded areas. They show some parts out west, most of the southeast, and then for albopictus, it's a broader range. Now this is there is some debate on this, and the next slide I'm going to show you shows collection records. So the caveat to collection records is not every place is sampling for these mosquitoes, and so there are places where you could miss it. But you'll notice from 1995 to 2016, so this is about a 20-year data set. Red means that the mosquito was collected there 3 more times. On the left, we have the yellow fever mosquito. On the right, we have the Asian tiger. And you can see that the Asian tiger mosquito is a lot more common. Now, this was introduced in Texas in the 1980s and has since spread. Now, the biology is a little complex to go into, but we believe it's displaced Aedes aegypti in much of its older range. And so, I did quite a bit of work last summer in Alabama trying to find Aedes aegypti. And it's pretty much, at least in northern and central Alabama, we can't find it in places where you would expect to find it. There are a couple of pockets here and there along the Gulf Coast, but it's not nearly as successful as Aedes albopictus. Where it seems to be firmly entrenched is southern Florida, Texas, and Louisiana. And so if we look at some of the virus here, sort of points to these places being the areas in the United States at greatest risk. So this range map here shows the light blue are places or states that had travel-related cases of chikungunya in 2014. And so we had about 2,800 travel-related cases that year. And this was introduced in the Caribbean in 2013. So then, we're looking at less than a year later, people popping up with travel-related cases, much like Zika virus. And you can see in subsequent years, the number of travel-related cases went down. We had 12, autochthonous means locally acquired cases. We had 12 confirmed in Florida in 2014, 1 in Texas, and then none the year after that. Now, contrasting that with Zika, this map, every state in the lower 48 had travel-related cases. We had about almost 5,000 travel-related cases in total. 220 local cases of locally transmitted cases in Florida. We had 6 in Texas. Now, I don't know if you can see, but the hatched areas are places with local transmission. It's just the southern tip of Florida and the southern tip of Texas. And those are places where Aedes aegypti does really well. And, that mosquito can be active almost year round in those parts of the United States. So this is no coincidence. I mean, we think that, yes, we do have the Aedes albopictus mosquito, but we don't think it's nearly as efficient of a vector as the yellow fever mosquito. So I'm going to wrap up with talking about dengue. We have a long history of this virus in the Gulf Coast states from the colonial era through the early 1940s. And a lot of people don't realize that. If you go back and look at some of the descriptions of the diseases, it's obviously dengue. Now, yellow fever also used to go through the colonies off and on, and so these diseases were co-occurring. There have been no locally acquired cases between 1945 and 1980, but since 1980, there were outbreaks periodically along the Texas-Mexico border. There was a large outbreak in 2005 where we had over almost 1,600 confirmed cases on the Mexican side of the border, but about 25 cases in Texas. And a lot of this has to do with human behavior. and just exposure, having window screens on houses, time spent outdoors, those sorts of things, because the distance-wise, or what, not much difference, and the mosquito populations are very similar there as well. But this is something we see repeatedly when we have large outbreaks on one side of the border. They tend to be smaller on the American side. And this is just the epidemic curve from that particular outbreak. And you can the Mexican cases are in blue, and the Texas cases are in white there. Now, since then, there's been more activity. In 2013, there were 23 locally acquired cases in Texas across 3 counties. And then we've also had outbreaks in Florida, Key West, 28 confirmed cases in 2009 and 65 in 2010, and just a handful here and there. So my take-home point is that if we go back and look at this map, these are happening in the same places as you're seeing in like southern Texas, southern Florida, as the Zika cases this last year. So going forward, I think those are the places where transmission is most likely. So I'm going to summarize what we know for these 3 diseases. Recent outbreaks have been fueled by the top vector, Aedes aegypti. We don't think albopictus has been involved, even though in the laboratory studies we know it can transmit the virus, but it doesn't seem to be as efficient of a vector in the natural conditions. And so my conclusions are that the Gulf Coast region is at greatest risk for local transmission. Climate there makes mosquito activity possible during most months of the year, and the risk of outbreaks in the United States for most of these diseases are pretty low. I would say that in most of the U.S., endemic viruses like West Nile virus are more concern. Now, I have a caveat here, and that's that virus mutation has the potential to alter transmission dynamics. So, as we saw with West Nile, a few mutations and it took off. So there could be something with Zika virus that makes it, some mutations that make it more efficient for Aedes albopictus. We haven't seen that happen anywhere else in the world, but that doesn't mean it won't happen here. So it's something we have to pay attention to. So I'll wrap up by talking about some control and prevention strategies. I have 4 major strategies listed here. The first 2 are ones that you can take on your own. Source reduction, larviciding around your home. This is removing or chemically altering larval habitats, particularly in residential areas. My next slide is going to have a little bit more about that. Structural barriers and personal protection. So window screens are vitally important. Housing improvements that prevent mosquito entry. And of course, use of repellents and protective clothing to avoid bites. Avoid bites when you're outside. And then residual spraying. So if you do have a really intense mosquito problem, you can have companies come out and do applications of barrier spray. And this is on places where mosquitoes rest. And so it will get them while they're resting. Now, it has to be applied every 2 to 3 weeks because it breaks down in sunlight. And one of the things you want to avoid is spraying flowering plants, because this can have a negative effect on pollinators. So, I highly recommend to homeowners to, stick to the source reduction and larviciding, and only go to spraying whenever these other non-chemical methods actually aren't working. And then the ultra low volume spraying are something that tends to be done with the public sector at a much larger scale. And just looking here, this is the zoom in of that one diagram. This is showing many places around the home where you can, just, unclogging your gutters, making sure you don't have standing water in certain places, dumping out water and used tires, a couple times a week, getting in a habit of going through your house, and then spreading the word to your neighbors. Because if you only do this alone, it's not nearly as effective as if other people on your street are doing it also. And then my last, one more point is that sometimes just dumping out the water isn't enough. In this picture, you'll see, I don't know if you can see the larvae swimming around here, but there are also eggs along the edge here. And so these can lay resting eggs, and so they can just be hanging out there waiting for the next flood event, and then they can hatch. So sometimes you need to scrub out those eggs and make sure you don't have those hanging around too. And Mark, you can go ahead and cue that final question. And then this is my last slide. And this is, I know sometimes it's hard to identify mosquitoes, and these are just some general tips, but I'm also plugging at this bottom, this website here, the University of Florida. There's a photographic guide to mosquitoes of Florida, but it does include mosquitoes that are largely found throughout the eastern part of the United States, not just Florida. So it's a very good guide. It has some very good photographs of the larval stages in addition to the adults too. And you can see a lot, even with just a magnifying glass. You don't necessarily need to have a microscope to see some of the distinguishing features. So it would encourage people, if they're interested, to go to look up this the identification resources on this website. And with that, I'll be happy to get into the question and answer part of the session.
Okay. All right, folks. Yeah, feel free to ask any questions in Q&A, and then you can also put them in chit chat if you'd like. So let's see. We had 68% on that last question said both B and C. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Okay. And so can I see what do I need to hit to see that poll?
Let me see. So I'm doing share results now. Can you not like look down at your toolbar, make sure the window's not behind something. And if you want to share, if you're done with the slides, you can stop sharing. You should be able to see it then.
I think that's what yeah. So if I stop share, I can definitely see it.
Okay.
And so yeah, so B and C was the answer I was looking for there. And the reason, and so to me, I think one of the things that I was noticing last year when I would hear interviews with people on NPR, talking about the mosquito and what's important and what's not, sometimes people would mention the non-human host and sometimes they wouldn't. And the fact that we don't have that, but we did for West Nile, that's really vital, I think, for a virus spreading and getting entrenched in the United States. So without having that virus, or excuse me, the non-human reservoir, and then without having vectors outside of certain places, that's going to limit the spread. So West Nile, like I said, it was a perfect storm. We had wide-ranging animal hosts, wide-ranging vectors, and it was just, perfect scenario for that virus to sweep through the United States.
Okay. And this was the third one, I assume. Was that one right? Was West Nile virus the correct answer there?
That is the correct answer.
Okay.
Hi, there was a question that came to me through email for you, and it is one on what types of pesticides you might use for your clothing.
For your clothing, mostly what I would recommend would be permethrin. There are some things that you can do for pre-treating your clothing. And the good thing about permethrin is it works against ticks too. And you can actually, there's there's clothing on the market that already has that impregnated. And permethrin is it's a class of mosquito. A lot of people may be familiar with pyrethroids. It's a class of insecticides that were originally identified from chrysanthemums. So plant compounds some of them do have insecticidal properties, and that's how it was discovered. Now the synthetic versions of them have been altered to make them a little bit more lasting than the original, the compound from the plants. But permethrin is what I would recommend.
Thank you. And we have another one here. It says, what is the strain of Zika virus that reached Florida, the Polynesian or the African South Asian?
The Polynesian, I believe. And so if you look, there have been, I have to look up the paper, but there have been some comparisons of the virus. And so once it left Africa, there's several different lineages, and it was in Asia for a number of decades. And then it popped up in 2007 in French Polynesia, and then 2013, Micronesia, and then French Polynesia. And if you look at sort of its progression, you can go back and look at viral isolates from each of those incidents. You can see it changing. And so the virus that we have now is quite a bit different genetically than the original African strain, but it's definitely more closely related to the Polynesian.
And I'll put up that other. Sorry about that.
Go ahead. I was going to ask if you would put up. You got it.
You want the closing poll up now?
We'll do that. If we could go ahead and put those poll questions up. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Let's see.
Angela,
we have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have one coming in from Angela. She says, are there any particular garden plantings we can use to discourage mosquitoes from visiting and staying in our garden?
That's a very good question. And I don't, off the top of my head, I'm not the best person to ask that question, because I do know that people talk about citronella candles and things like that. So I think there's probably there's probably some good information out there. And I would think some things that have like a volatile or like minty smell might drive mosquitoes away. But off the top of my head, I don't have any good advice for that.
Derek, are birds, or a lot of people will keep the shy, and the name is escaping me now. They like gourd shells. When I growing up in southeastern North Carolina, a lot of people had gourd shells, and they would keep birds, and then they say those eat mosquitoes and things. Is that an effective way to control mosquito populations?
That's I heard that growing up too, and so I think that the jury's out on that. I think there's, I would say definitely any predation is good. I've heard that about bats too, that bats can be considered like that you're putting bat boxes up in your yard can help control mosquitoes. And I think all those are anecdotal. I don't think there's been a good, hardcore study to test that. And some people could say, well, you might do more harm than good by attracting hosts, because a lot of mosquitoes do like to feed on birds, and particularly the house mosquitoes that do transmit West Nile. And so, it could be a double-edged sword there, where you're attracting predators, but you're also attracting hosts for certain arboviruses.
Sure. Someone asked about propane catchers.
Yeah, and so there are some like mosquito magnets. I think some of those are quite good. Like what I discourage are just general like insect zappers, things that you stick in your backyard, because they're going to kill a lot.
So much fun though.
A lot of those are going to kill beneficial insects too. So I discourage using those things that are non-discriminate. But the mosquito magnets tend to work pretty well, and they also work on biting midges, which in certain places can be just as big of a pest as mosquitoes. No-see-ums, people might be familiar with that term.
Hey, we have a few more, and one of them is about the water. Like, will running water, is it true that mosquitoes will not lay when the water's actually running?
Most of the time that is true. Now a lot of this has to do with just the female's oviposition behavior, that she tends to avoid running water. There are other biting insects that do like running water, like black flies. Like they need oxygenated water. So, but mosquitoes, they tend to avoid running water. So if you have a creek, oftentimes if there's any sort of current moving through there, you won't see mosquitoes laying eggs there. But if there are still places in the creek without much of a current, or sometimes you'll have in the summer months, you'll have no rain, it'll start to dry up in certain places. And if you have, you can have pools that, those can then become breeding grounds. So, you have to look at that creek or stream year round and kind of see how it's behaving all the time. Does that make sense?
It does. And we have another one that just came in. Is what pesticides or formulations are used for residual application?
So the residual application, now most of what's been approved tend to be pyrethroids. So it's sort of the same class of what I was talking about with the permethrin belongs to. Now those are broad spectrum. So they're going to be zapping everything out there. And that's why I was recommending that you use those with caution. And so, people are not supposed to spray those on flowering plants, because the effect on pollinators. And then the formulation. So, I showed, if you see the mosquito trucks coming around, that's a different formulation. That's going to be a very fine aerosol. What we call ultra low volume spraying. And so that just has killing power for a short period of time, as long as it's in the air, and that dissipates within 24 hours. The residual application is formulated so that it leaves a residue on a surface, and it's going to continue to kill for 2 to 3 weeks. Now, the shadier the area, the longer it's going to last. It breaks down in sunlight, so that has to be reapplied every so often.
Thank you. And I see one more. It is, will chlorination, like in a swimming pool, will that deter mosquitoes?
I think it should. Now, I don't know for sure. That's a good question. I think some mosquitoes, I know that chlorination, they can handle it. Some can't. So it's going to, it's a case-by-case basis. The Culex mosquitoes, the house mosquitoes, they tend to be a lot tougher. So I wouldn't be surprised if they could handle some level of chlorination. I don't know what the level is where it would kill them. Now I know abandoned swimming pools have been, if you have houses that where no one's living, like that can be a source of mosquitoes. But of course, someone's not, chlorinating that regularly. But my feeling is that, if you have a pool and you're maintaining it, and you're adding, chlorine regularly, that should, prevent mosquitoes from laying eggs there. But I don't know the level of chlorination. That's something I should look into.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? It seems like too in a pool that you usually have a pump or something going so that the water is not just
right. It's not just sitting there.
Anybody else have any other questions? I don't see any more. Well, Dr. Matthias, we greatly, greatly appreciate you being here today.
It was my pleasure.
That was awesome, and I'm still not looking forward to mosquito season. We thank you greatly for being here, and everybody, we will be back on May 5th. And if you enjoyed mosquitoes today, you're really going to enjoy May, because that's when we will be talking about ticks and tick diseases. So we'll see y'all then. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.